organized with the general support of the Mellon Foundation on 25 years of transnational migration paradigm, challenges, blind spots and opportunities for a global perspective. Ayşe has, as a social and cultural anthropologist, in migration research very much shaped and influenced that paradigm. She actually can count as one of its inventors, probably. Do you all know what a paradigm is, by the way? Yeah? So, and those of you who are currently in my class, or who used to be in my class on German migration history, know her from a reading that I regularly employ in my classes. This one here. It's a short article from 1995, titled German Turks in Berlin, Social Exclusion and Strategies for Social Mobility. And even though it's 25 years old, as old as the paradigm, it hasn't lost any of its value. It's a wonderful historical source to get insights into the cultural strategies of German Turkish migrants in Berlin in the 1990s. But it's also super helpful to explain the transnational approach and also to show what you can do with Bourdieu's theory of field and of the different forms of capital and migration studies. And you have to remember that in 1995, when this article was published, we were still under the government of Helmut Kohl that lived on the exclusion paradigm. So the exclusionary anti-migration approach of Germany not being an immigration country. And only the new government in 1998 accepted that migrants were here to stay. And that was a fundamental change that was done with the help of a new paradigm, at that time the integration paradigm. So you're all probably familiar with that. If migrants are to stay, they have to be integrated, they have to get eventually good Germans, that's how it works. And at that time, so we are speaking now of the years 1998 to 2004, that paradigm seemed like progress. It made possible that in 2005, a new residency, immigration and integration law came into effect. And now imagine that allegedly progressive law was 10 years after Ayşe and her collaborators had shown already that the integration paradigm is flawed, and that you have to leave behind the methodological nationalism of the integration paradigm altogether if you want to understand how migration processes work. And the transnational paradigm that they established in research is older than the integration paradigm that rules in politics and public discourse until now, which is crazy, I think. And it's one of these, what Ernst Bloch called Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen, the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous that we struggle with. Ayşe is a professor for social and cultural anthropology at the University of Vienna and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. She worked in Berlin between 1994 and 2003 and received her habilitation at the Freie University. And she's also closely connected to the Central European University that Bard College also has close links with. She was chair of the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology there. She has held multiple visiting professorships and fellowships in universities and academic institutions around the world, and has published widely on migration, on urban restructuring, transnationalization, and the state. And she also has an extremely interesting current research on the role of migrants for disempowered and deindustrialized cities, and published last year together with Nina Glick-Schiller, who some of you remember from the text on methodological nationalism that we read, a book titled Migrants and City Making, Dispossession, Displacement and Urban Regeneration, that has far-reaching consequences for the explanation of the rise of right-wing populism in neglected regions. And as much as we would love to hear from her also on that research, we decided that we would have to postpone that for a future visit, which will hopefully happen. So thank you for being here, Ayşe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy actually that I have the chance to be here and to share my work, or actually my ideas about my reflections on transnational migration paradigm. As Marion mentioned, we are in a way kind of sister organizations, but even in a very kind of like an Indian film that you kiss both of them kiss a tree and it's like a kissing. So we are in that way that related, but I think we have very common concerns and in terms of education and in terms of what we understand from academic world and training students, training quote unquote. So I was asked to look back actually to migration research landscape in the 1990s, as Marion mentioned, where that I was writing, where I was actually doing my research and then reflecting in Germany from today's standpoint and possibly through my own work. So this is what I will do. I will do what I'm told to do. But I will do this through the lens of transnational migration paradigm, because why I do that, because it emerged in the 1990s, beginning of 1990s in the US, but it slowly made its appearance in the German migration research landscape at the very end of 1990s, beginning of 2000s, and I look at it through that lens because this perspective was hailed at that time, not immediately, there was a big skepticism, as a major intervention into the integration, assimilation, inflicted landscape of migration research, including Germany at that time. And I think it did change the research scene. So the scholarship on transnational migration grew out of an kind of an concern about the impossibility of capturing people's livelihood, trajectories, biographies, employment, their political mobilizations, and everyday structures within the confines of the institutional encasement of nation state. So scholars of this paradigm underlined the increasing disjuncture between geographical space and social space, and they argued that the dynamics, and this juncture was actually very much a product of the increasing globalization. It did not start with globalization, but it depends, of course, how you start the globalization, how you trace globalization, but it was very much emphasized with that. So then how to and argued that because of this juncture, you could not explain the migrants' practices, relations, by looking at the countries of origin and by looking at countries of settlement. They argued that, and I think this is the important part of it, the sources of their actions and their frames of actions could not be traced back to one place, but to a kind of has to be seen embedded into a social space connecting several places through multiple networks. So it was a networked social space connecting several geographical spaces, so to say, discontinuous spaces in a way, and connected that. Discontinuous that, I mean, you made my life much easier because you have read methodological nationalism article, so it goes very much to that. So I will skip those parts. So it was, there is no doubt, I think, that the approaching migrants' practices and social dynamics in this way opened new ways of looking migrants' ties, settlement processes, and within and across the national borders. So in this way, they have challenged the unidirectionality and cumulative understanding of integration, a migrant settlement process, which was formulated as integration assimilation, and that was seen as a process of uprooting. So you start from one place and you uproot yourself and to become part of the other. But this uprooting, this terminology, has of course, it came all with the, together with all the malaise that it carried with itself, and this is why this whole, at that time, within the integrationist and assimilationist perspective, that you saw a lot of studies in terms of identity crisis, identity conflicts, cultural conflicts. So because this was very much traced back to the problem of uprooting. You could see several of these in the current refugee studies too, and what kind of tropes are inscribed into that kind of uprooting. Here it is, with the refugees, it's much more abrupt. It is not that kind of, but you see that how, for example, trope of trauma organizes that field. So they challenged this unidirectionality and cumulative perspective. But above all, what they challenged was that the nation states are the containers of the social processes that are taking place within the nation states. And so they are the containers of the processes of migrants' practices, agencies, and the whole settlement process. So they said that we need to move beyond methodological nationalism. So, okay, you have read about the methodological nationalism, but I will just say that what the methodological nationalists did was not only assuming that the nation states were the containers of those processes, that they assumed that the members of the states share a common history, norms, values, social customs, so that migrants from that kind of an entity coming to the other need to be integrated. So it was a kind of operated with an isomorphism of a space, population, and culture, norms, so that everything that was projected upon to each other. So what they did was that they introduced new conceptual framework, that the scholars in that, and they provided new entry points to re-narrate the migration process and settlement. I'm doing something here which is not good. Okay. Beyond the confines of the nation's borders. So I think one of the most important concepts was that transnational social fields. Transnational social fields, that's networks of networks, connecting the different, that transcend the political, geographical boundaries of one nation, and they form the relevant field of action and reference for migrants' practices. And this was a space which allowed multidirectionality, reactivation, deactivation, expansion of networks. And the important part was that it did not refer only to the people who moved. It covered people who had also not moved. And another important part was these fields coming from a very much Bourdieu kind of an understanding. There were kind of power hierarchies among the networks. So it was not a flat ontology in that sense. And I think this got lost in later on, that which you could say actually transnational migration industry in terms of the scholarship, that there it got very much lost, because these power hierarchies were important. And I had used the work that you had read, actually, that I had used it in terms of the concept of transnational social space, as to analyze the social positioning struggle of the migrants through conversion of different forms of capital accrued within a kind of a network space. And I tried to show, actually this was one you have read, but there were several at that time. What I was trying to show is that if you want to understand the taste, fashion, and consumption habits, practices of migrants, actually you should look at this transnational social space rather than looking at what kind of cultural codex that they were operating with. Because this was the time still, and I think, the grip of culturalism is very, very strong in migration scholarship. So that trying to understand, take it outside of their culture, how that culture hybridized, what happened in terms of, rather than those, trying to look at it in terms of this transnational space and the conversion of different forms of capital. So it was a paradigm shift, because in migration scholarship, so I'm calling it as a paradigm shift because it assumed, it has introduced different units of analysis, that transnational social fields was kind of a different unit of analysis, and a new conceptual framework with the transnational social field, and new entry points. So what it did was that it opened a theoretical space to address the dynamics and processes that remained veiled and obscured within integration and assimilation paradigms, or mainstream paradigms of migration research. So new topics and research agendas appeared beyond either or logic, because this is the integration, assimilation. Integration is a kind of a watered down of the assimilation one. It is very much a kind of an either or logic, but which is taught to be processual, but it is teleologic. That actually integration's perspective is very much part of kind of modernization paradigm. It was interesting that the still this modernization paradigm had that kind of a grip in the 80s, 90s, and still that is, you had the kind of the assimilation perspective striking back. So if we say that the transnational migration paradigm posed challenges to the mainstream migration approaches. However, in order to assess what kind of challenges are they and whether there are possible blind spots in those challenges, I think we need to scrutinize the unit of analysis issue. Did it really challenge the unit of analysis? Well, is it so easy to challenge methodological nationalism? What does it mean to go beyond nation state as a unit of analysis? And the second one was that it claimed to have a global perspective. And what did global mean at that paradigm? And actually, this is what I will be building up. I will be building up my talk upon these, and I would like to, it's not a suspense story, so I could tell you at the word I will be getting at, and I would like to put these into question mark. And what does that mean? That's why they failed at that level, and what could be the ways to get out of that dilemma. So global took many meanings in the transnational migration term. It took many meanings in a very blurred way. It was used to refer to the general flow of goods, capital, people, and it was a very generalized way of flows in terms of labor, information, capital. But because of the particular understanding of the global working of the global forces, I think that transnational migration perspective failed to really understand the working of the global in the migration processes, and also it failed to completely break away from methodological nationalism completely. And actually, in many areas of research, it came through the back door. And you could still see it in several of the works. For example, where did it come back through the back door, and where do you see the resilience of methodological nationalism? In the way that locality was conceptualized. Actually, the absence of, sorry, I don't know who is bombarding me, but I don't know how to turn it off. Absence of theorization of locality. So, and the resilience was, so when I say that absence of theorization of locality other than state space. So this was the problem, I think. And where we saw the resilience also that in terms of the persistent grip of ethnic lands, that the ethnic lands, I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but it is looking through, assuming that ethnicity as an analytical category, and then through that looking at the dynamics through that category, as if it were a self-evident category, as if it were not a product, but taking it as an a priori category, which is very strong in migration scholarship. So no doubt that especially, but what they did was that there was a framing of the global relationally, which one has to give credit to the scholars who pushed for the transnational migration paradigm, especially in its initial formulations, Nations Unbound. Then later on, I think it changed, and they connected what I refer to is that what they did was that they connected the cross-border movements to broader processes elsewhere. So when they were looking at the migrants, what was the dynamics there, that the reference points, this comes together with the transnational social space, but they connected it to what kind of dynamics taking place in other places, and they looked at it in a hierarchically structured way. So it is not that every kind of connection, but there were kind of structures involved in that connections. So this was important, but then the crucial question came, what was the elsewhere? What did they mean by elsewhere? What was elsewhere? And if you looked at it, then elsewhere was conceptualized actually very often as nation states, that other the places were conceptualized as nation state. So it is at one point, this is a very important intrusion, looking at it in terms of those kind of connections. People, for example, who refer to migration as forced migration, actually they try to do it that way too, to connect it to the other dynamics. So in that sense, they were good for that, that was important. But then the elsewhere, well, if you looked at it, that you saw that the different, they conceptualized as the power hierarchies between different nation states. So still that these dynamics came, and it was this different nation states imaginary, and in the scholarship also, was engraved under the terminology of sending states, receiving states, countries of origin, countries of settlement, and sometimes third world countries. That at the beginning there was this kind of a world systems theory influence, and they used it, this kind of the center periphery language, but that disappeared. So despite the efforts not to take nation state as the unit of analysis, then they failed by, in terms of you saw that nation states as unit of analysis were circulating within that the paradigm. So, and here it comes to the core of the problem: how to conceptualize spatiality, how to conceptualize space. So while the relevance of the borders, so what they did was that they said that the borders could not be taken to be absolutely. The relevance of borders were questioned, and in terms of understanding the dynamics of the transnational migrants and their practices and everything. But the interior of the state was left untouched. That the interior of the state is, when I said that it was left untouched, it was treated as if it were even, as if it were homogeneous. So there is a very critical thinking of cross-border, but very little reflection in terms of the interior. So what did it do? This indifference to the interior of the state. So they did not address the transformations of statehood and and the fragmentation of the interior, if you want, state territoriality, and the territorial inequalities from within. And so the boundedness was criticized towards outside, crossing the boundaries, but there is no problem in terms of the boundedness of the state vis-a-vis the interior was not put under scrutiny. So what they did not address, as I said, the territorial inequalities and within nation states and the changing role of the state in terms of creating those inequalities. And this is very within the national territory. So where did you see that? The dynamics of the subnational entities, localities, or cities were never differentiated nor connected to the global dynamics in varying ways. On the contrary, their analysis remained very detached from the analysis of process of uneven neoliberal globalization. This is the time when we are talking about neoliberal globalization and the unevenness, perpetual unevenness created with neoliberal globalization, especially in relation to space, were never taken into account. So we see this very clearly in research on migrants and cities. So no differentiation among cities within the same nation. So people did the research on Berlin. That became the research for Germany. Others did in France, Paris. That was the migrant incorporation in France. So then, not only they didn't stop there, that it became also comparative paradigm. So there was not much, and if you think about it, at the same time, Saskia Sassen was writing Global Cities and showing how the cities were being detached. I mean, of course, she was looking at the particular kind of cities that she identified as global, but how they were detached from the all kinds of statehood, state actions in terms of their positionality, and this was not reflected to the scholarship at all, that the transnational migration paradigm. So they did not really, and they did not take into consideration that looking at through Amsterdam or Paris or London, these are not only metropoles, but they are also gateway cities. So they had very different kind of concentration of different groups, populations. So that has been generalized as if there were that kind of the even space of the nation space. But why? Because they lack the conceptual tools to address the perpetual unevenness produced within the workings of the global, within the nation state. So they did not have the global. That's why I said that one has to ask about it, what they understood. It was a very simplified understanding of the global. I mean, Nina Schiller, that she said that no, nations unbound, we try to do those kind of much more elaborate way. There was, but still, it was within a kind of units of homogeneity of the nation space was present there. So despite the increasing number of research on migrants in cities, and this is what was thought to be breaking the convention, that actually they reproduced this kind of research reproduced kind of the nation states as units of, as if they were units of analysis, because this was because of their weakness in the understanding of uneven spatiality of globalization vis-a-vis state territoriality. So this lack of concern with territorial inequalities was also apparent in the way places of departure and places of settlement were also being understood, as I said, that countries of origin, countries of settlement. But here it was also very interesting to see, depending on from which shore of transatlantic you were looking at it, different states acquired, different questions acquired prominence. In terms of in the US, scholarship, because of the histories, legacies, policies, and discourses around migration, that it was actually, they have to be there, they are good, they are there for good. They have to settle, assimilate, integrate, and everything. Then homeland ties were a problem. So this is what the transnational migration paradigm tried to poke and say that it's not a problem. Actually, it should not be seen as a problem. But because of the nature of the migration, they had only the sending, quote unquote, sending states became a variable in the analysis. Somehow, US, place of settlement, its institutions, its structures disappeared or remained at a very general level. In Europe, on the other hand, the nature of migration was different. People from the same country were going to very different countries. So then you had different countries going to the same place, so that the place of settlement became a variable. And not only that, because of the ideology that they are not part of here, that to be critical, you try to show that they are part of here, not true. And then they try to underplay in Europe, the critical migration scholars try to underplay the homeland ties, and then they are here. So Stefan Cassels has this book, Here for Good, 1974, he wrote it. Here for Good was revolutionary. When Heckman, who is a very conservative researcher, but when he said that this is an immigration country, these were the kind of revolutionary kind of stuff. But what happened was that it is also interesting to see how the scholarships are embedded and they are part of these kind of the environment and their time. So it depended where you were positioned. So in terms of what they did and what came out very strongly at that time was the opportunity structures. So different places provided very different opportunities to go against the culturalism. The culturalism perspective was very dominant. So how the migrants behaved were, how much time I have?
5 minutes.
5? Okay, so I'd rather go quickly. Okay, so because people were saying that, oh, they are not integrating because of their culture, because of their religion and this and that, but people were saying that, look, same people from the same country went to very different places and they had shown very different kind of formations. So it is dependent, it is related with the opportunity structures. So this was a very important opening. But no matter how you looked at it, opportunity structures were conceptualized at the national scale too. So opportunity structures were not, and you saw this very clearly in ethnic business, ethnic entrepreneurship, migrant business, in that literature, because if you do research, you see that the opportunities for business in Berlin and in Chemnitz would be different. But then they said that, okay, they recognize that because if you do empirical research, it's very difficult not to notice that. But then they said that, yes, every city provides a different context. But when you say only as context, then it becomes impossible to compare. So every city is unique in itself. So those opportunities, those dynamics were not connected to broader dynamics, processes, which the cities were part of it. So where did we, this is what was where we started with Nina, and trying to see a kind of an alternative approach. And so beginnings of an alternative approach, I said. So how could you capture the differential unfolding of social, political, and economic forces, and in terms of the break the resilience of methodological nationalism, we found it in urban scaling scholarship, which and it provided the conceptual tools to explore the dynamics of uneven specialization of globalization and its effects on new forms of governance. That is because most of these things were related with the governance, politics, and differential livelihood. And this also perspective provided a conceptual vocabulary. Because not that these people were not smart, but they did not have the conceptual vocabulary, and that conceptual vocabulary did not come from migration scholarship. And that's why I think it's very good to be reading very broadly, being exposed to very different disciplines, very different areas. So that so what happened was that they showed, the scholars from the urban scholarship, they were showing that what globalization meant was that not only the relationship between different spaces were changing between localities, but the state's relationship to different localities was being varied. So that the German state relates to Berlin differently than to Chemnitz also differently. So it's not only this kind of, so nations, it did not mean that going beyond methodological nationalism did not mean that nation state did not matter. Nation state mattered a lot. But the way that nation statehood was different, and how the state related to different groups and different places had to be, you have to have a conceptual armature, apparatus to capture that kind of variation of the state space of intervention. So it showed that that you could not study and understand, explore what is happening in a city or in a neighborhood. This was the time of neighborhood research also, and it's flourishing again now. That you cannot understand without reference to how that connectedness of that locality that you're talking has been mediated, and what kind of local, global, and regional connectedness were taking place. And these were not like matrushkas. So it is not nested into in each other. And what you see, a group's transnational reach and its effectivity is dependent on those dynamics, those scalar dynamics. So when we looked at it, so I have 3-4 minutes, okay? Then I'm finished. Let me just jump. So the aim was trying to find a kind of a analytical vocabulary to address the spatial variation and temporality of migrant practices and relations. So this is what, that's why when I was giving it that the blind spots, the blind spots were actually in terms of spatiality and lack of conceptual apparatus to capture temporality. So, and I think these are the major challenges for today's perspective. How to overcome, that is, these were the major fault lines. And I see one in terms of developing conceptual tools in order to bring migrants and non-migrants, the binary between foreigner and quote-unquote native. How could you overcome within a kind of in your approach in the analysis, that you do not start with this kind of a binary? And I think this is one of the major challenges. And then we might need a different conceptual vocabulary. What happens if we shift our perspective and pose questions that would destabilize the concept of migrant and the kind of the migrant dispositive in the Foucauldian sense, from shifting from the concept of mobility to displacement. How we tell a story of migration matters. How do we, how we are telling this, how are we telling the story matters. So our framing not only determines what we reveal and what we obscure, and this is what Saskia Sassen calls it analytical tactics, in terms of how to get what is under shadow, which is how could you put light on that, but also it determines the semantics of dividing, thinking about difference, connections, and commonalities. That is very much migration scholarship is based on thinking about difference. And then you establish the difference and then you bridge it. It is just, I always find it very interesting, for example, in the Iraq invasion, that first the neighborhoods were sorted out in terms of the Shia and Sunni, and although they were mixed at the beginning, after the invasion they sorted them out, and then there were X number of projects to combine and to bridge them. So if we change our lands, from mobility to displacement, could we have a different mode of seeing it? And first of all, could this shift make certain things visible that remain obscure in the mobility perspective? I think one important thing is that displacement enables us to draw attention to interrelated processes. Mobility enables you to focus on the activity. Displacement necessarily connects you very different kinds of processes, which are usually aligned under underlying migration. And this is what, in the beginning, that I said that the relational global part was important. So how it enables us to see how seemingly independent processes and locations might be connected, to bringing them together to each other. And why do I find the concept of mobility problematic? One, first is that, I will stop there, that it is a slippery concept in terms of because nation state occupies a very strong place, a central role in defining and institutionalizing what counts as mobility, whose mobility becomes visible and whose mobility is not seen as mobility. And in terms of the mobility high and with migration, defining with mobility, internal mobility, rural, urban mobility got lost. When you hear migrants, you only think that the migrants are cross-border migrants. And also, not every mobile person is designated as migrant. And there are X number of people who are designated as migrants who had never moved from anywhere to anywhere. These are the second, third generation. So this mobility, together with the migrants, it separates and it reproduces the existing registers of whose mobilities we are taking into account to govern, and it is also with the governmentality of populations very much related. And second, it actually disconnects the people, that as if there are the sedentaries and then the mobile ones. And I think this feeds into the native-stranger divide and this binary, and I think it is very important to move beyond these binaries of difference generated by national imaginaries that dominate public discourses and as often establish the building blocks of antagonistic division of the discursive field of populist politics. So these binaries are really bread and butter for this kind of populist discourses. So at the end, I will say that it did not, it failed in a way, that breaking with the methodological nationalism. But on the other hand, by showing and kind of this relational understanding of migration, that it opened the analysis to connecting elsewhere, no matter how they felt there, that the transnational migration paradigm was an important intrusion. Then I will stop here. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Ayşe, for giving us this enriching and insightful talk with so much information that we have to. I feel that I have to work on it for weeks on all the ideas that you presented, looking back on the history of the paradigm and showing the failures in recognizing this connectedness between global developments on the one hand and on the other hand subnational, local developments. And let me start with a first question maybe. I was wondering, would you think that these failures or shortcomings, do they have to do with the institutionalization of migration studies that also, at least in Germany, only started in the beginning of the 1990s? Before we didn't have an institutionalized migration research, and academic institutions always being organized by nation states. Is there a relationship?
Okay. I'm not so sure. I mean, I think in terms of the institutionalization of migration research, there was a neglect. There was a neglect because it was just a kind of a side topic, and it was not a very kind of you would not find interesting stuff. I mean, that's why I have a problem to call myself a migration scholar, because I said that, I found most of the literature very boring. It's really very repetitive, very boring. You have to, and I think because it was, migration studies were actually child of nation building processes that were very much related with that. And it was seen as a problem. It was always a problem field. And so that you had to solve a kind of a problem. So you did not see any kind of a very sophisticated analysis or very different entry points. It was like social, kind of a very simple social work kind of topic. And in Germany, mostly that the migration studies came from pedagogy.
Yeah.
That is so. It is in terms of the, and very much connected with the social work.
And also with political advising.
Yes, but with consultancy. So the way that it had developed, so it was very much. That's why I said that they were very always connected to the state, but not in a very. I mean. State would not allow, would not want that kind of a critical kind of a perspective, but it did not. And what happened afterwards is there are now X number of migration institutes, but it's a very much policy index topic. And those questions dominated the broader questions. Actually, if you look at it from philosophy, you could enter to whole migration issues. You could enter to migration from very different areas. But because it was very much as a kind of a problem-solving issue, that I think that constrained. And I think it was not a coincidence that transnational migration paradigm was very, very strongly carried by the anthropologists at that time. Sociologists came very late and wanted authorship on it. I'm a sociologist and an anthropologist, so I'm both, so you cannot say that I'm just disregarding the other one. But I'm not so sure in that sense. It is very much entangled with seeing like a state. That you see in migration scholarship very strongly seeing like a state. Even within the critical one, that is because the state starts looking at it in a very different way to adjust, and you see these kinds of perspectives.
Thank you so much, Ayşe, for this very informative talk, and more generally for all your work. Because when I started doing migration research, it was already with the benefit of the work that you have done.
Oh,
so I didn't have to make all these mistakes that had been made before. And I also wanted to thank you for making this very strong case for interdisciplinary research, especially including the work done by geographers,
yes,
urban scholars more generally. I also see a lot of potential for working between these fields. My question is sort of similar to Mariam, but it goes in the direction of money, of funding. To what extent this failure to overcome the persistence of methodological nationalism, but also the ethnic lens,
yes,
is caused by the funding for research?
Yes.
That we see both in international context but also in national context. And I know that you've worked in various places and was wondering what's your take on that one.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot. I mean, I really, in terms of the, not only funding, but of course funding is very prominent, but also in terms of power and access to certain institutional power. So this failure, the grip of ethnic lands, once I think it is very strong in built into the scholarship. I remember that when we wrote this, the locating migration. That's where we brought the first scale thing. What we did was that we invited a group of migration scholars and a group of urban scholars and geographers together, but we said that we don't want you to come and present on kind of the papers, but we want you to look at your own work through the lens of 3-4 questions. And and beyond ethnic lands, migration scholars came. It was almost impossible because they didn't have data on it. They didn't have any other data other than looking through the particular ethnic group, and they did not look any other relations too. So it was these lacunas were in the data from the urban scholars and the geographers, and they were very good. I mean, that's also Neil Brenner was there, Michael Summers was there. So and Neil still says that for the first time he realized about the importance of migration. He never thought about it. This was also very interesting. So that this skipped through their land. So it was very important. But on the other hand, that at the end of the day, if you are applying for funding and for grants, then if you design in a very elaborate way within the ethnic lands, and if you try to go beyond methodological nationalism, which is very strongly built, then you are rocking the boat. You are rocking the boat of many people. And so it is, and we know how it functions in grants and in academia too. So it's interesting that some people now, I was telling you in Moscow, it was in the kind of a conference I was there, and there were some very hardcore integration researchers. I could not believe my ears because they all started saying against ethnic lands, against methodological nationalism and everything, and business as usual. Then afterwards, just the whole design was in that same way, and they were very big grants. So in a way, in an ironic way, it acquired prominence to say that beyond ethnic lands, beyond methodological nationalism, and you just tick these points and then continue. It's very, very deep, actually. So it became both for the, and it's very frustrating, very frustrating.
Thank you very much for your talk. What you just said kind of partially answered my question, but I was wondering if you see any value to continuing studying migration as a separate field now, and maybe why not just integrate it into anthropology or geography or anything else? Like, so why does it still have to be a separate field? What is the justification to that?
Actually, I would not see it as a kind of a separate field in itself, because once it starts reproducing itself, it starts guarding its boundaries also. If you ask me, I said that I don't call myself a migration scholar. Why? Because I think migration is a very interesting and important lens to look at the social, political dynamics. If you want to study state, it's a very good lens. So that is why I think there has to be, I would not say even interdisciplinarity. So it is a particular kind of lens. Otherwise, if you do just migration research, then it really very easily goes to this pedagogy, social work, consultancy, and policy work. I'm not saying that thinking about policy implications is bad. I think we should really think about the policy implications of what we do. But that is not indexed to the way the problems are defined so that the policies are construed to solve the problems.
Yeah, just one comment. I mean, I think it's interesting. What you just said brings me back to an earlier question I had about the shift from mobility to displacement. I mean, the very fact of framing migration as a problem is a problem, right? So, I mean, when we're looking at, you know, from this policy lens that you're talking about, it seems like it would be crucial to get away from that basic problem metaphor. But I'm interested in the shift from mobility to displacement. I'm really, I feel like you offered a lot of very interesting justifications for that shift. I'm not a migration studies scholar. My understanding was that one of the reasons for shifting to mobility from something like migration would have been to focus on the agency of migrants. So that, you know, as we shift to the migration regimes paradigm, right, there's a sense in which one can't just focus on, you know, the state and attempts to keep people out, but also one had to see the migrants, people moving themselves as major actors in this field, however we want to term that, and that mobility was some way that at least blurred that, I mean, gave us some sense like everybody moves. I mean, from a non-expert in this field, right? Mobility sounds like, okay, well, we move. I moved here, other people move here, people move somewhere else. Like it's not, doesn't carry the baggage that migration as a term could. Whereas displacement could also, I mean, and I'm sure you've been asked about this, like to the extent that displacement is a kind of disempowering category because it focuses on what's happening to people, right, rather than what people do and what they choose to do. So that seems that that framing, which is the one that I had just in my head when I first looked at those terms, is really at odds with how you described the situation. So I'm curious as to how you've thought through these.
I think that's a very good question, and I mean, I know that's why that the mobility is, and actually it became a hype, and mobility studies. And mobility, if you're not talking about mobility regimes also, mobility, and that's in terms of when I said that it is the state actually who defines what counts as a mobility and what not a mobility. As you say also, walking here, I moved, once they put me into a session in a panel where because of migration to mobility studies, and there were lots of people who were organizing the traffic in the city. So that is how you organize the traffic. So, and they said that we are mobility studies. Yes, of course, they are mobility studies, I understand. And I wondered why I was there. So I was put there. So that is there is that kind of a danger, and it actually opened the field in such a way that you it equalized in one way or the other, so that I don't want to talk about the refugees together with the tourists. But on the other hand, I know that refugees, migrants, internally displaced are really the boundaries between them are very blurred, and these are the products of particular kind of registers, and these are governance mechanisms. Also, these registers are very much related. So, when you say mobility, that it has its agency in it, then it might be a question of how best we could conceptualize the agency. I know the problem people have with displacement, because displacement implies passivity. So you are displaced. So there's something happened, then you have displaced. But displacement, the way that I am using, and actually in the book that this is how we use it, displacement always in connection to dispossessions. And I'm not really working on tourists. This is what I'm working on urban regenerations. And what urban regenerations do, they displace people too. They displace, and displacement is very much, and if you go back to Harvey, it is the accumulation by dispossession. So you cannot talk about displacements without the dispossessions and without connecting into how the wealth is generated. So this is the kind of the frame. I'm not saying that I'm using this shift from mobility to displacement within particular, studying particular groups of people, that how, if you say it, and if you ask in general, in city making, I will refer to it. And that actually, in terms of displacement, could be social displacement. You could say that with the mobility also social mobility, but the way that social mobility has what kind of a language, that I do not want to take it. I don't think that we could, agency should not be voluntarism, should not be equated with the voluntarism. Agency is within the kind of the particular constraints, conditions that enables. So there's a so with the mobility, yes, Erasmus mobility. So I want to go there. Student mobility, there are people, sports mobility, students mobility, tourist mobility, migration, and then the migrants and then the refugees. So if you put them all together, and within what kind of a conceptual landscape you bring them, I'm not so sure. I do see the agency point, but the agency is not voluntary movement or involuntary kind of movement. Agency you could talk about the agency in every condition. So that's what I would say.
Would it be possible to connect these ideas to the some empirical findings?
Mm-hmm.
And in the book that you published, you focus on, or you compare three disempowered cities. One being Halle here in Germany, the other being Mardin in Turkey,
Syrian border, yes.
And the third one was
Manchester,
in
New Hampshire.
Yeah, and especially Mardin. Could you tell us how social empirical realities that you found in Mardin fueled these or fed into these concepts?
Yes, actually, these concepts were really. We did not start with the concepts. We were struggling. It was really a long process. But Mardin contributed, contrary to what people expect, contributed to the theoretical framework, especially question about temporality, much more substantial way than the empirical findings that we had in the other cities. One example is that we dealt with a group of people. So group of people who had to flee for their lives from Mardin, and they returned. So it was a return migration. And the question was that why did they return from a place that they fled? And they fled for their lives because also they had the experience of genocide. So why did they come back, and why did they come back at that time? Then it's not natural kind of the connections, and how that particular constellation empowered this group of these people in the city making processes, so that how they were able to reach out very different, very powerful centers, like US state secretaries, Pope, and I mean, these are not very powerless. For that place, I used a lot of WikiLeaks documents for that place, because the WikiLeaks they were very good. The American embassies their reports were very elaborate about the place, much better than any kind of the report that I was able to find. But all sorts of embassies representatives were there, and so then you ask, this is a group of people whose places were no-go zone until 1990, until 2000 actually, and how it came together with the value creation processes. So how a group acquired the value and lost the value also. That is, how could you connect different processes in that place, being acted out in that place together? And there it was the most, I think it was the strongest case. And then people say that depending on whom you are talking to, sometimes people say that how could you compare Halle to Mardin, that is on the border, Syria, and it was a place of poverty, violence, and then it flourished. That, I mean, whomever you can think of were visiting that place. On the other hand, that I think it is significant that Hilton opened in Mardin. Yes, there were 3 Hiltons in Turkey. One in Istanbul, the other one is in Ankara, third one was in Mardin. So, I mean, these are very striking kind of things. And this minority group, which suffered genocide and which had to flee, were at the center of this value creation process of that city. So I think that these concepts came from the empirical research very strongly.
And why were they at the center? Why? Like why? What
Because
was
it
their
was
value?
okay. I could tell you partly because at one point this is very much related with the EU accession, Turkey's EU accession, and Turkey was accepted in 1999 as the candidate. But in order to for that candidacy, you need to also prove that you are you have to improve your human rights records, and that is also very much related with religious freedom. And this is a Christian group, and you have to show at least that there is a safety, and you have to improve your records. Everyone knows that. I mean, these people had to flee again. And second, the city was flourishing. Partly it was in poverty, but they saw the chance. The Iraq invasion was very important. Who was going to feed and build Iraq? And the major road from, not the major, the only road from Europe, land road, to Iraq is through that city. That is on that gate. So there is no other way. For the Iraq invasion, that the Turkey didn't allow this. So there were lots of very different kinds of factors, and there was several attempts to regenerate the city that did not succeed. They did industrial district, free trade zone, people didn't come and invest. You had to provide safety, perform safety. This group of people were very important for the performance of capital-friendly safety for this place. So it's nothing to do with their particular qualities other than being a Christian minority, persecuted Christian minority, and they Christian, Catholic and Orthodox Church, both of them actually. I spoke with all the very dominant leaders in Turkey and then in that region. With the radicalization of Islam in Middle East, it was very important to keep a Christian population. So for that also they acquired value, a symbolic value and a kind of a cultural value, which was also then used for kind of place of dialogue and for tourism and reconstruction industry. So yes.
Well, just that very story, Ayşe. I'm wondering, I'm probably the only one here who is not persuaded by the critique of the
Methodological
nationalism.
I
happened to read that essay thanks to a discussion we had previously in Marian. So, and just that story, but also in earlier moment of your talk, you say it's not that the nation states don't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't.
So for better or worse, they matter. I believe that for the better, right? But people might believe for the worse, right? But they matter because they are, and just this story says, we cannot understand that situation if you don't understand Turkey's interest in improving its human rights effort, in accession with the EU, the international situation, right? So you cannot understand what's going on without taking the pulse of the political situation. But so I'm wondering what exactly is the problem with that methodological nationalism. And from your talk, I heard two problems. One is that it's a bunch of unrecognized assumptions, right? So it's a kind of philosophically sloppy / ideologically sort of unrecognized blinders that we need to spot on, right? Recognize and then see if the nation states matter, how do they matter in our way of understanding this particular. And the other problem that you seem to say, to recognize is that migration research is too utilitarian, right? It's in the service of, the problem of problem, right? It's in the service of solving some kind of policy problem or social problem or this kind of problem. So it doesn't seem to have a full-fledged intellectual agenda or impetus behind it, or at least whatever. So I'm wondering whether that's the critique or there is something else that is also a problem with this.
With what?
With the methodological.
Okay.
Stuff.
I mean, in terms of
because you say it matters, so I'm wondering how it should matter.
I mean, of course it matters, but it matters in the sense that that's why I say that statehood is not unimportant, but statehood is very fractured. And this group of, if we remain within Mardin, what did we have with the developmentalist state? So that there was unevenness in the territory, but the aim was to improve all of them, to have a kind of a homogeneous idea of a kind of a state space. In our times, and then actually within the way, I hate to use this neoliberal, but the way neoliberal urbanism and then the state, what it does is that it relates to the places independent. I mean, it's not direct here. That is it was not the state initiating initiating this whole process. One part of it is these groups were able to reach state through supranational institutions. So it did not go, and because of that, and these supranational institutions mattered because of the geopolitics and because of the historical conjuncture at that time. So the state and made an announcement, made a call for these people to have them back. Set in 1999 and announced a call saying that you could come back to your places and it will be safe, and these people really left everything. They didn't come. They did not come. After 99, that after this the candidacy was accepted, and then they said that you will have access to your property, so that the property rights were very crucial, and they used the church leaders. Church leaders were very much active. So they came. These people came when they saw a chance that this coming back will empower them. They will acquire a power in that. So if I remain within the nation state one, that why it didn't work at that time. So the state power is so fractured also in this whole context, and so they were able to access to state power through various different instances. But at the end of the day, I mean the other part of the story, this place, which was very in the shiny, every brochure, every airline company's brochure there, I could not believe what was happening to this place, and they were planning all those charters from London and so for those kind of the tourism, because it's heritage tourism, because it's in terms of history, it's a very important important place. No matter what they are, Turkish state exercised violence after losing the elections, partly there, and in a way destroyed part of the city. So when I'm saying that nation states matter, is nation states. I'm not negating anyway that the nation state power, but if I try to understand that, I like it with the Sasson again, that very much, because something is happening within a national territory. Doesn't mean that it's a national process, and that is the core of the methodological nationals, thinking that it would be a national process. It is not. And you could see that in economics, you could see that in politics, you could see it in several ways. But again, this does not mean that you completely could detach yourself. State becomes an important actor, but one of the actors. So I think this is why I think the problem with the methodological nationalism. In a way that it is, you could find it in terms of in the narrow analysis or in the migration scholarship with the neighborhoods too. I mean, you could try to capture everything, but you cannot. The neighborhood is not independent of other places, and these nation states are also not a unified kind of an actor vis-a-vis the whole space of it. That is my problem. So not in terms of I understand your concern. That it's not very easy to say that, oh, this is methodological nationalism. I mean, I don't want to deal with the nationalism, being exposed to it, but thinking about state sovereignty and dismissing it is not very easy, I think. So that will be my answer. I don't know whether you agree or not, or you want to pursue.
Yeah, any more questions? I'm very happy that I think that we covered some of your research now after all.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Ayşe. And let's give applause.